Tharlan let out a breath. The acceleration from the main drive of the ship pushed him backwards in his seat. As the fleet's huntsmaster, he should have seen it coming. The enemy would never leave them alone for so long. There were few things in the universe that could challenge the Venatorians. Many species have tried, either out of fear or out of greed, and almost universally they have failed. The Venatorians had a rule: no hunting sapient prey, but it wasn't rare that they had to break that rule. When they did, not much could stand in their way. They were the apex predators of the known universe. But right now, Tharlan and the rest of his fleet of 400 ships were being hunted. They were predators on the run. Nearly 100 enemy ships blinked into existence on the star map. Gravity suddenly changed direction as a warning appeared overlaying the star map. "Hit on the rear. We just lost beam drives 1 and 2. Thrust is at 60%, a technician called out. They had just made a jump up the gravity well of the star system they were in, and it had cost them all of their velocity. They couldn't jump again without consuming mass from the ship itself, as dictated by the laws of physics. Alarms sounded. Tharlan glanced at the star map. Missiles were coming, ETA 8 seconds. Point defense had no chance. "Get us out of here! Emergency jump, backup drive!" It was a terrible idea. Tharlan guesstimated a good chance that it would leave the ship inoperable, but having already lost 2 of the 6 antimatter drives and close to 50% of radiator area, the flagship of the 2nd Venator fleet was already more or less dead. "Sir, the backup drive is for ejecting the command module." "I don't care! I'm not leaving anyone!" Tharlan growled. The technician entered the command for an emergency jump. Tharlan braced himself for the transition. The first missile struck. The remaining never did, or maybe Tharlan just didn't feel it as the ship displaced itself by over 10 light years in an instant. A brief silence followed the jump. Tharlan managed to fumble with the star map, now displaying a new unfamiliar star system. The ship had appeared much further down well than he had anticipated, far ahead of the rest of his fleet. Not just that though, his ship had appeared right over the 3rd planet in the system. Any further down well, and he along with the rest of the ship wouldn't be much more than a soup of subatomic particles. The ship was also not in orbit. Even now his main drives were thrusting desperately, trying to offset its downward velocity and prevent it from crashing straight into the planet. But that wasn't the worrying thing. When Tharlan checked the ship count reported by his ship's sensors, the numbers were much higher than he anticipated. Not only had most of his fleet made it through, the ship count reported more ships than existed in his fleet. Many, many more. He was in an inhabited system. And then, 100 suns lit up the blue ocean surface of the planet below him, and Tharlan was thrown against the side of his seat as the entire ship lurched. It was late in the afternoon when Eliza pulled up into the driveway of her cabin. The waning rays of the early spring sun poked out through a gap between the clouds on the horizon, lapping up the snow gathered on the branches and needles of the great fir trees. She quickly entered through the door, carrying a box of equipment that she had brought home. The wall-mounted display opposite the couch came to life at her presence, greeting her with a simple, "Welcome home, Eliza," printed across the center. She ignored it for the moment, knowing full well that she would have to spend hours that night working on the weekly reports of the local conservation efforts. She entered into a small storeroom and put down the box of equipment. Sunlight streamed through the small window, casting a spotlight on the shelf at the opposite wall, highlighting the scattered model spacecraft of the Seoul United Defense Fleet ships and a small military medal gathering dust. "The hero of 16 Psyche," read the engraved text. Not a moment after she had left the storeroom, a shrill electronic tone filled the cabin. Eliza stopped in her tracks and glanced at the wall display. The welcome message had been replaced with a blinking red general public alert. "Kinetic impactor warning issued," it read. "Take shelter." An electronic voice read out the same message. At the words, Eliza felt her heart start racing involuntarily. Disregarding the latter half of the instruction, she ran out the door and looked up past the treetops towards the direction of the coast. A great beam of light was cutting up across the deep blue sky, and as she watched 2, 3, 5 more beams joined it, converging towards a point in the sky. What? Her words were cut short as the thundering roar of the nearest beam reached her. By the time she ran back inside, the beams had blinked back out of existence. What happened? Kinetic impactor warning. Shut up! Thinking quickly, she tapped the display and opened a long-forgotten group chat with people who she hadn't talked to in years. Her connections in the fleet. She didn't even need to ask. The messages had already started coming in. The first was a voice recording. Holy shit! The sender's voice whispered into the microphone, over a cacophony of background voices. The Pacific laser array just shot down something the size of a small asteroid on a direct collision with North America. The people are saying, and I quote, that it came out of nowhere, and FleetCom just enacted Clause 6 of the First Contact Protocols. Eliza paused the recording. Well, fuck, she exclaimed to no one in particular. Clause 6 entailed a full-scale retaliation to an existential intelligent threat. Earth was officially at war. Evacuate, the displays urged Tharlan. Imminent failure. He didn't have to think twice. Imminent failure on an antimatter-powered ship could only mean one thing, and the fact that the system had to tell him in the first place meant the auto-ejection of the command module had failed. Tharlan didn't bother loosening the safety restraints and sliced through them with a claw. He launched through the now zero-G command module with a push from his 4 rear limbs, and pushed open a heavy metal door to a dark corridor. Along each side was a row of escape pods. He quickly made his way into the closest and closed the door behind him, while the rest of the command crew each climbed into their own pods. The moment the door was sealed, a clear, breathable acceleration fluid flooded the pod, and it shot through a short tunnel and out the side of the ship. Checking the rear camera views, Tharlan realized that the entire ship had been cleaved clean through, with scorch marks visible at the edges of the cut. A laser attack. As the escape pod barreled towards the planet below, Tharlan quickly tried to establish a comms link with the rest of the fleet. He had to warn them. The natives were hostile. But did he have to authorize a full-scale invasion? If he did, there wouldn't be much left of the natives afterwards. On the other hand, the natives had undoubtedly declared themselves as dangerous, and if he didn't seize the opportunity, there might not be much left of his own fleet. He couldn't take any chances. His escape pod began shaking as it hit the atmosphere of the alien world. "The natives are hostile," he exclaimed into the comms link. "As Huntsmaster, I am authorizing an attack on their homeworld. Does anyone copy?" There was only static. A jolt of turbulence shook his pod as it tumbled through the air, and plasma covered the external sensors, acting as a Faraday cage, cutting him off from his fleet. They'll never hear his warning. It wouldn't matter though, as bursts of electromagnetic radiation appeared on the pod's sensors, marking the FTL missiles appearing among the native ships. The rest of his fleet had come to the same conclusion as himself. Eliza tracked the flaming trail through the sky. It was no debris, that much was certain. As it approached the ground, a trail of flame shot out, slowing it down before it vanished below the tree line. There were only 2 possibilities for what it was. It could have been an escape pod from one of the ships in orbit, but if it was, she couldn't recognize the model. More likely, and she couldn't believe she was actually thinking this, it was a genuine piece of alien technology. And it had landed just a few kilometers from where she was. Was it likely dangerous? Certainly. Would the military be sending troops out to investigate it? Undoubtedly. But Eliza was closer. After a moment of deliberation, she grabbed an old-school shotgun and stepped out of her cabin and ran towards the small plume of smoke that was starting to rise in the distance. With a grunt, Tharlan pushed open the door to his escape pod. The landing had been rough, but he had made it out relatively unscathed. Carefully surveying the situation outside, he found himself in a small crater, surrounded by tall alien foliage coloured a deep green. White patches of particulate water ice were melting in the mid-afternoon sun, and the temperature was certainly chilly. A regular Venatorian might have had some trouble surviving in such cold conditions, but not Tharlan. He was in his element. He was an apex predator in a dense forest. Even so, it was an alien forest, and Tharlan needed to be careful. Stepping into the small flaming clearing created by his descent, Tharlan looked up over the treetops. Beams of bright light were slicing through the pale blue sky from unseen places on the surface. They were the same lasers that had blown his ship clean out of the sky, he reasoned. He headed in the direction of the beam, an idea forming in his mind. When Eliza arrived at her destination, the forest fire had died down already, leaving a small clearing of charred trees. She quickly located the object, embedded partially in the ground, and carefully approached it, holding her gun at the ready. It was something out of a sci-fi movie. The structure was made of metal, with a large opening on one side, with a corresponding thick metal cover lying on the ground just beside it, in a pool of a strange liquid. It was a landing pod, and judging by the size, its previous occupant was at least twice the size of a human. But why would it be a kinetic impactor? The purpose of a KKV of this scale would be to make a world uninhabitable. So what kind of a strategy was landing troops in a world that was effectively destroyed? Opening an interface on her neural implants, Eliza quickly brought up a video of the lasers shooting down the KKV. They had completely infected the entire internet in the hours since the initial incident. Pressing play, she watched, as seemingly out of nowhere the object appeared accompanied by an electromagnetic pulse. She watched, as the footage switched to a different instrument with greater magnification, with stars streaking past the view in a blur before it locked onto the object. Eliza paused the playback. The frame wasn't the highest definition, and most of the objects were drowned out by the exhaust flare of a powerful torch drive, and she could barely make out what looked like a radiator fin on one side. She unpaused the footage. For a split second, the frame turned white as the laser struck, but after the exposure corrected itself, the object had been split into two large chunks and multiple smaller ones. A moment later, several specks of light streamed out from one of the large chunks. With startling clarity, a memory flashed before her eyes. She was in a small shuttle, looking out the external sensors at the shattered form of 16 Psyche, with the planet looming large below her. The smaller pieces of the asteroid were already burning up in the atmosphere, but on the larger chunks, the artificial lights of the research station still flickered. A small group of specks streamed out from the remnants of the station. At first, Eliza hadn't known what they were, but she had learned quickly. They were people, trying to jump from one chunk of the shattered asteroid to the other, where the last remaining shuttle was about to depart. None of them had made it across before the flames consumed them. Eliza shook her head clear of the memory. Now was not the time to dwell on the past. Looking around her, Eliza noticed patches of less charred ground. They were wet with the liquid from the strange landing capsule, forming a trail into the trees. Quickly opening a map, Eliza realized the trail led west, directly towards the closest facility for the Pacific Defensive Laser Array. "What are you?" Eliza muttered. Taking out a portable communicator from a bag of supplies he got from the pod, Tharlan pointed the antenna in the general direction of where the ships in his fleet were located in the sky. With a crackle, the link came to life. "Hansmaster Tharlan, please report." There was a brief moment of static before a reply came through. "Hansmaster, you're alive!" "Of course I'm alive. Now what's the situation up there?" "We engaged the natives after we lost contact with your ship. They are more resilient than we initially thought. Their ships are somehow dodging our FTL missiles, and their ground-based lasers are preventing our fleet from getting close. Do you have any suggestions?" "Would it help if I got rid of them?" "Of course, sir. The closest is 82 kilometers southwest of you, near the continental coastline." Tharlan confirmed his direction and redoubled his pace. The sun was getting low in the sky, and although no dangers had presented themselves so far, he knew well to keep his guard up in an unfamiliar environment. "Oh, and one more thing," Tharlan said. "Yes, Hansmaster. Prepare one sacrificial ship and get it jump ready as soon as possible, just in case." "Copy." It wasn't the first time Tharlan had authorized a full-scale invasion. He hoped it wouldn't be the last, because the only way that could happen was if he was defeated. But he didn't lose. The Venatorians didn't lose, because they didn't take any chances. Tharlan darted with experience between the long shadows of the trees cast by the setting sun. A faint, distant roaring sound had him disappearing quickly into a grove of trees. Carefully, he craned his head out of a gap in between the trees, looking towards the source of the sound. A small aerial craft zoomed across the sky towards the direction that his escape pod had landed. Tharlan pulled his head back. His descent had undoubtedly been noticed, and the response was faster than he had hoped. Turning around, he redoubled his pace westward. He just hoped that the natives wouldn't be able to track him. Even though he was sure in his ability to evade any pursuers down here, he had had enough of being followed in the past year. After making sure the aircraft was far gone, Tharlan turned on his communicator and located his fleet in the sky once more. A second of static later, a link was established. A voice different from the last time responded. "We've lost 40 ships, Hansmaster." 40? Tharlan sucked in a breath. That was a tenth of his fleet. "What is happening?" "Hansmaster, their ships are too fast. The acceleration is borderline impossible. There should be nothing alive aboard those ships, yet any artificial intelligence should have long since been eliminated by the electronic warfare strikes. We can't hit them, not without them being able to hit us with those ground-based lasers, and none of our ships are jump-ready yet." "This can't continue," Tharlan said, just as much to himself as anyone else. He looked around him. The sun was below the horizon now, but the twilight cast a blue glow onto the surrounding forest, and the distant beam of the laser gave each tree a second shadow. It was a beautiful world, he thought. Beautiful and deadly, as its inhabitants had proven. There was only one realistic choice here, but he hesitated before giving the order. It wasn't an easy order to give on multiple levels, but he couldn't take any chances. The survival of his fleet depended on it, and the survival of his species depended on the survival of the fleet. His people were a nomadic species, great colony fleets sailing amongst the stars, never staying in one star system long, and always leaving without a trace. They depended on hunter fleets like his to scout out safe systems and to defend them. He was never defeated because defeat simply wasn't an option. He won't allow it. If he had to kill countless sapiens, he would do it if it meant it would save countless more of his own. If he had to exterminate an entire species to save his own, he would undoubtedly do it. And if he had to order an entire world destroyed, he would do it. It was how the Venatorians had stayed alive in the dark forests of their homeworld, and later of the universe. It was how they had become apex predators because the only other option was prey. "How's the progress on that sacrificial ship?" "It's not ready yet, sir. Engineering is estimating another half an hour at least before the geometry drive is ready again." "When it is ready, I want it translated down well, directly into the surface of this planet. Optimize for as much surface destruction as possible." There was a brief pause before a response came. "But sir, Hansmaster, you'll still be on the planet when—" "I know. Now do it." Static. "Copy, sir." Tharlan sighed, putting the communicator back into his bag of supplies. Even though the aircraft was gone, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still onto him, and he hated it. He didn't like being the hunted instead of the hunter, but the truth was that he and his fleet had been on the run for the past year now. He glanced upwards at the night sky, with the laser beam cutting through it, drowning out the stars. Out there, among that blackness, death hid at every corner. The Venatorians were slowly losing their once feared place in the food chain, and it had become clear that they were no longer the only apex predators. There was another species out there, the same one that Tharlan had been running from. The interlopers, most called them. They were the only species that could challenge the Venatorians, a second apex predator. And it was beginning to look as if Tharlan had stumbled upon a third. Tharlan looked over his shoulder. He was sure now. Someone or something was nearby. It could just be a member of the local wildlife, but it still put him on edge nevertheless. Whatever it was great at avoiding detection. He couldn't even determine which direction it was. All he knew were the occasional faint snapping of branches, the rustling of leaves, and the smell of something foreign in the air. He didn't dare use his communicator right now, but briefly pointing it skywards, the small screen on the side told him how many ships it could connect to. 306, it read. 1/4 of his fleet was gone, and it was all his responsibility. If only he had chosen a different starry system to jump to. If only he had done a more thorough analysis of the system before choosing it as an escape route. If only he had been more careful. None of this would have happened. It was because of the carelessness of his ancestors that his people didn't have a homeworld. And now, Tharlan has made the same mistake. A twig crunched underfoot. Tharlan felt his heart rate spike. Not careful enough. He moved soundlessly through a patch of tangled branches, using the sound of the wind to hide that of his movements, and then stopped to listen. A moment later, he decided that no one and nothing had heard him. He continued into the forest. It was fully dark now, but his natural night vision had no problem seen in the pale light of the planet's moon, and he continued to stick to the shadows. A few times he thought he heard the sound of something a distance behind him, and each incident had him stopping and observing, but nothing had presented itself. But if something did, he would be prepared. The fact that he may not exist anymore past the night was only a subconscious unease, easily suppressed. He would be cautious all the way until he watched as that ship slammed into the planet. There was a clearing up ahead, with the moonlight illuminating half of the grassy field. He circled to the right, keeping close to the tree line. Leaves rustled to his left. This time it was unmistakable. Whatever had been following him was just across the clearing. He turned, crouching low, and approached the edge where the trees gave way to the grassy field. Eliza was close now. She had followed the trail cameras scattered throughout the forest, many of which she had set up herself, detecting the presence of wildlife and logging them into a spreadsheet. When it had shown a trail heading in a straight line westwards, she had known that was her target. Now, though, the field cameras were getting sparse, and there hadn't been a single detection in 10 minutes, but Eliza had been out enough times to recognize the signs that something was nearby. For one, the wildlife was silent. Not a single bird called out. She gripped her shotgun tightly. She had 8 heavy slug rounds loaded, each enough to kill an elephant in one shot. A clearing among the trees revealed itself to Eliza's right. The moon hung over the treetops on the opposite side and cast half of the field into shadow. She stepped slowly out into the grass, holding up her weapon. Someone was staring at her. She could feel it, or rather, her subconscious could. Something moved out of the corner of her vision. She quickly turned her head towards the shadow side of the clearing. Nothing. Slowly, she circled the edge of the roughly circular space. A gust of wind shifted the branches of the trees blocking the moonlight, and she was suddenly face to face with a reptilian monster. It was crouched on 4 limbs, with another 4 snake-like appendages sprayed out over its back. The moonlight glinted off the sharp blades at their ends. His head was sleek and pointed, with a vertical sharp fin running down its length, and terminating at a razor point just above its jaws, and intelligence shone in its 2 eyes. The instant the light had revealed its form, it lunged at Eliza with blinding speed. Eliza raised the shotgun and pulled the trigger. Tharlan's eyes tracked the barrel as he lunged forward. The crack of the shot in the quiet night startled them both. The 12-gauge round deflected off the reinforced blade of the limb Tharlan had held up. In one smooth motion, Tharlan sliced forward with 2 of his back limbs, Eliza parrying with her shotgun. Biological graphene met carbonized steel, the former cutting cleanly through the latter, leaving Eliza with 2 halves of a shotgun, of which she quickly discarded the barrel half, worked the action on the other, and held it up, pulling the trigger into the bladed limb heading for her head. A sharp crack and pling, and the round embedded itself into the ground. Tharlan recovered quickly from the third attack. Standing up, he slashed forwards with his claws, trying to disarm his opponent as Eliza stumbled back. He made sure to keep the weapon within his view at all times, prepared to intercept any attempts to aim it at him. The gap closed. Swish, swish, swish. and the third swing caught Eliza on the arm, sending a wave of pain as it sliced into her flesh. With the other arm, Eliza raised the truncated gun once more and fired off a shot. Tharlan had jumped back by the time Eliza pressed the trigger, the round going wide. Eliza was back at the edge of the clearing, the tree line right behind her. She could run now, every instinct told her to, but running was not how she had become a war hero. She hadn't run when the terrorists had taken over the experimental propulsion laboratory on 16 Scifi, and she hadn't run when the entire asteroid was barreling towards Earth. She wouldn't run now. She held her shotgun in her good hand, aimed just away from her target. She knew that if she moved it the wrong way, her opponent would react immediately. The two locked eyes. She knew that look, the careful, calculating glance, tracking each and every one of her movements. That had been herself. Too careful. She ran forward, raising her shotgun, and fired a shot straight to the alien, who blocked it with ease. The impact of the round drove it back, and he used one of his back limbs to stabilize itself. Its other limb sliced at Eliza, but she didn't stop. She threw her shotgun. The limb redirected itself to knock it aside. Eliza dove down onto her back, her momentum carrying her forward. The alien sliced with his claw, catching Eliza across the abdomen and cutting into her flesh. She screamed from the pain, but her plan had worked. She could see the confusion in her opponent as it tried to move back into a defensive position instead of engaging her, as she grabbed the barrel half of her shotgun lying on the ground, with one side of it sharpened dangerously by the cut, and stabbed it into the leg of the alien. It hissed, stumbling back, and using another one of its limbs to stabilize itself, leaving only two distracted Eliza, who was now outside the range of its claws. The two blades shot towards her, but she had already picked up the other half of the shotgun, and as she held it up and fired, the two blades moved to block the shot instead. The impact of the shot drove it back. She moved her aim downwards. Bang, bang! Severing the two back limbs holding up the alien's weight. And as it tried to use its remaining two back limbs to turn itself back on its feet, Eliza squeezed the trigger again. The shot hit the alien in the abdomen. It let out a loud hiss, and Eliza aimed the shotgun at its head. The alien brought his arms up in a futile attempt to protect his head, hissing loudly as it tried to move back. Its eyes reflected the moonlight. It was no longer the calm and calculating gaze that had studied her just moments prior. It was filled with panic, helplessness, fear. Eliza tightened her fingers around the trigger. She was starting to feel faint from the blood loss. She had to finish the job quickly. But now, she stopped. She had seen those eyes once, on her fateful mission at 16 Scifi. It had been a boy, perhaps age 15, among a group of scientists that had been bound and gagged in the station's control room. He had looked at Eliza as she entered the coast to scram the reactor, destroying the asteroid and saving Earth. None of them would make it off the asteroid. "Don't take the risk. Just do it now," everyone had told her. She had hit enter. Now she looked at the alien in front of her. They had closed their eyes in anticipation for the shot. She breathed heavily. "Shoot it!" her brain screamed at her. "Don't take the risk." She tightened her hold on the trigger again, but then her mental image flipped and the alien was now her, back on 16 Scifi. Just trying to do the logical thing. Just trying to survive. It hadn't attacked her out of aggression, but out of fear. Fear of losing. When the native had pointed his weapon at Tharlan, he had known it was the end. Not just for him, but for his fleet. The natives were a true predator species, and they wouldn't stop even if his fleet took their world. The Venatorians had become the hunted. He closed his eyes, heart pounding, subconscious still telling him uselessly to get away. Far, far away. The shot never came. Slowly he let his breath calm back down before cracking open an eye. The native had lowered his weapon, discarding it on the ground. It tried to sit down, but his step faltered, and it collapsed on the ground in front of him, unconscious. Tharlan brought one of his remaining back limbs up, holding the blade up to its neck. He could end its life right there. But why hadn't it killed him? And why couldn't he get himself to deal the final blow? With a sigh, he scooped up his discarded weapon and flung it deep into the woods, before lying his head on the grass. He realized the laser beam to the west had gone out along with his distant rumbling. The only sound was that of the wind. His communicator crackled. Hansmaster? Hansmaster Tharlan, are you there? Tharlan picked up the communicator. Yes, I'm here. What do you need? He said faintly. The ship is ready for jump, but the natives have stopped their laser attacks and are bombarding us with radio signals. We have no idea what is happening or how to proceed. What do I do, Hansmaster? We're still continuing missile bombardment, but do I authorize the jump? Tharlan opened his mouth and was about to say yes, reflexively, but paused. No, he responded. Cease all fire, and put together a diplomatic team on that ship. Hansmaster? Sir? You heard what I said. Now do it. Tharlan dropped the communicator and fished in his bag of supplies, bringing out a can of universal sealant. His 2 severed limbs had already stopped bleeding, the arteries having closed off automatically. He sprayed some sealant on the wounds before his eyes caught on the native, lying on the ground, with blood still coming out of the 3 gashes on his abdomen. He glanced at his own clawed hand. What is happening? He muttered, before using the remaining sealant on the strange creature. You're a brave thing, aren't you? He said, looking at the figure prone on the ground, who had just a moment ago charged straight at him, knowing full well that he was the better fighter, and who had then refused to kill him, instead putting blind trust in him to do the same. He turned his head up at the night sky. The stars were out. He hadn't realized before how numerous and how bright they looked from down here. Yeah, I can appreciate that.